I am going to be talking about this case that happened in Biskopsberga, Sweden in 1808. And this is a case where there was some strange globules kind of moving in front of the sky that left this kind of iridescent kind of residue on the ground that some witnesses saw. But before we kind of get into the details of this case, just a little background on the kind of type of case this is. This is from William Corliss, and if you don't know who William Corliss is, he was kind of a cataloger of all sorts of anomalies that collected them in these various books. And this was in his book called Lightnings, Auroras, Nocturnal Lights, and Related Luminous Phenomenon. And he classified these type of cases as luminous aerial bubble cases, which he describes as large assemblages of colored spheres or bubbles drifting randomly, quietly, and almost playfully. Observers often compare them to toy balloons and soap bubbles. Their changing colors and iridescence strengthen the soap bubble analogy. These soft glowing spheres do not detonate destructively like ball lightning, but disappear silently like real soap bubbles. Hundreds of bubbles may fill the air during this phenomenon. And he goes on to kind of break this phenomenon into two other kind of distinct types. The first one is low-level objects that superficially resemble soap bubbles. And the second one are swarms of these higher altitude objects that appear to primarily move as points of light, but seem to drift with the wind in kind of a buoyant manner. And the kind of the first example that he gives is going to be the case that I'm talking about today. But again, he, in his kind of evaluation of these type of anomalies, he says, well, they're puzzling. These aerial bubbles are probably explainable without gross modifications of chemistry and physics, but we know so little about them that we can kind of only surmise this. So, and I think in these cases, it's probably a natural explanation, but they're just so intermittent that we don't really have an explanation. These cases are also sometimes referred to as solar bubble cases. And if you recall the case I spoke about in the last lecture by Wilhelm Schickard, that was also a case that has been referred to as a solar bubble kind of case. So before we get into the details of the case, a little background about kind of our main character here, which, just like the last case with William Schickard, was the scientist that investigated this case. So Erik Acharius was a distinguished Swedish botanist. He was known as the father of lichenology for his pioneering work in the classification and study of lichens. He was born in Gävle, Sweden. He studied under the renowned botanist Carl Linnaeus at Uppsala University. And if you don't know who Carl Linnaeus is, he's the father of taxonomy. So how we break down different things into categories there. And I apologize if I mispronounce the Swedish names here. Believe it or not, I actually practiced them several times, but then kind of in the middle, I kind of think I end up messing them up here. So anyway, so Acharius developed this systematic approach for identifying and categorizing lichens, building on Linnaeus's previous work. He published several key works, including the Methodist Lichenium, and that he's published there in 1803. And the Lichenography Universalis, which significantly advanced the understanding of lichen diversity. His meticulous classifications laid the foundation for modern lichenology, and he described many new species, earning recognition in the field. Acharius also served as a physician and held various academic positions throughout his career, contributing to the broader field of botany. His legacy continues to influence the study of lichens today, and named in his honor, they've created the Acharius Medal, which is an award that was established to recognize lifetime achievements in the field of lichenology. Recipients of the Acharius Medal are typically scientists who have made significant contributions to lichen research through their studies, publications, and advancements in taxonomy, ecology, or the conservation of lichens. Now, this medal here, I think this may be the original medal. So while this award wasn't actually created until like 1992, I believe, there was an original Acharius medal that was minted in the 1800s that they found in the Swedish mint. Now, I guess they don't really know why the medal was created in the first place, but they created this medal back in the 1800s, and they found it and created this award in the 1990s using the original, I guess, you know, gosh, molds or whatever you make coins out of to recreate this new metal that they now give out to people for their accomplishments in lichenology. So Acharius essentially decided to put his use as a scientific investigator to use investigating an encounter that he had heard about. So in June 1808, after receiving various reports of a strange and unlikely unprecedented phenomenon observed near the village of Biskopsberga, he decided to visit the area himself to gather accurate and detailed information. He acknowledges that the initial accounts were inconsistent and were not directly from eyewitnesses, prompting him to do this in-person kind of investigation. Acharius believes this event was noteworthy and worthy of documentation for the Royal Academy, and so submits a report of his investigation that is published in the Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences in 1808. This document would later be translated by J.C. Hauff for the North American Review in 1816, which is how most of us English speakers would eventually come to kind of find out about it. And in this document, he reports on this incident. So, on May 16th, 1808, an unusual event occurred in the village of Biskopsberga near Skänninge in Östergötland in Sweden on a hot, cloudless afternoon at roughly 4 p.m. Some workers of a local farm observed the sun dimming to a dark red, losing its usual brilliance. At the same time, countless dark brown spherical objects appeared from the western horizon, each about the size of a hat crown. And if you remember my last presentation about the German case, again, these objects were described as kind of hats or hat crowns kind of falling from the sky or moving in the sky. These balls traveled to the sky towards the east, becoming darker as they neared the sun and turning black when passing in front of it. Some of the spheres moved in formations before breaking apart and changing course, leaving behind wedge-shaped tails that gradually faded as they got further away from the sun. And again, in this illustration here, you can kind of see that as these objects are approaching the sun, they're in a spherical form. As you see them getting close to the sun, they appear to get a little bit darker here. And as they move away, they develop these tails before they eventually kind of fade away or become invisible. Now, one of the eyewitnesses for this case was a K.G. Weathermark, a respected citizen who may or may not have been a secretary of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Sweden. So they refer to him as Secretary Weathermark. The records as to who was the kind of secretary of the Academy of Sciences are kind of incomplete. I guess a couple years before this, the guy that was the secretary of the Academy of Sciences had been dismissed for some reason. And so there was a few years where they had an interim, kind of like a deputy director. Unfortunately, those records were not really kept, so there's no actual list. But when researcher Martin Schau and Wim van Noordhoek investigated this case, they do seem to believe there is evidence that this guy, Knut Gustav Westermark, was at least potentially a deputy director, could have been in charge of the Royal Academy of Sciences at this time period. But whether he was or not, he apparently was considered a respected citizen that people were to take credibly at the time. And he documented this event, and he noted as one of the spheres descended near him, it became invisible, but displayed a brilliant multi-kind of colored iridescent appearance, similar to a soap bubble. Upon landing, it left a brief, thin, transparent film resembling cobwebs on the ground. This entire spectacle lasted about 2 hours long. And during this time period, there was, as they said, up to millions of spheres that, cross in front of the sun, supposedly. Now, afterwards, if we were to take Acharius' report at face value, that the witnesses consistently described the phenomenon, and as we can see here, he drew supposedly only on the reports of eyewitnesses that supposedly saw the phenomenon. But he does say that supposedly all the people in the village were also observing it as this was happening over this 2-hour period. Now, Biskopsberga is, it doesn't really, it's not an actual town or city anymore. It's really is part of Skänninge, but it's it was a small kind of more like a farming commune, almost off the outside of the main town of Scaninga. And so it kind of still exists kind of as that. So if we were to take the reports as he describes them as accurate, that all these people did actually see the same thing as reported, it would suggest that there was a real physical phenomenon here, instead of some sort of like illusion. It wasn't, like corpuscles in the eyes, or eye motes like causing. If it was only one person, then that was perhaps the case. But if we're to believe this whole village saw it, and there was this physical evidence, there was obviously some kind of physical phenomenon that was going on. Now, some contemporaries have speculated that these balls were some sort of gelatinous substance carried by a whirlwind over the mountains or forests, which had somehow mixed with other chemicals in the air. However, questions remain about how such a large quantity could have been produced and how they managed to obscure the sun. Some other theories were perhaps there was like a soap factory that had started on fire, and that had released these kind of like bubbles into the air. And as crazy as that sounds, apparently there is some precedence for soap factories starting on fire during that time period. Um, but another theory that some have suggested that have studied the case, they've suggested that the sweetest spheres, as these would come to be known, might have been some kind of volcanic dust or ash. This theory links the phenomenon to the eruption of the Urzelina volcano on the island of São Jorge in the Azores, Portugal. This eruption occurred on the morning of May 1st, 1808, and again, I guess later in June. The eruption devastated the parish of Urzelina and created this basaltic formation that is now known as the Ponte di Urzelina, and left a trail of destruction in its wake. While the volume of spheres witnessed could certainly be explained by gases released during the volcano following days of intense seismic activity and eruptions, the puzzle does still remain about how the volcano could have formed these soapy bubbles as described by the witness Weddermuck. Now, it was Charles Fort who actually brought this case to kind of wider attention in his 1919 Book of the Damned. And Charles Fort often speculated about kind of fantastical explanations for some of these cases, like space vampires. But in this case, he acknowledged that this particular story hinted at a more terrestrial and likely natural cause, even though he could not identify one. He warned against the inclination to assume that all related data points point to a single type of phenomenon, suggesting instead that the external world is infinitely varied. And he specifically said the tendency would have been to jump to the homogeneous conclusion that all our data in that expression related to this one kind of phenomenon, whereas we conceive of infinite heterogeneity of the external, of crusaders and rabbles and immigrants and tourists and dragons and things like gelatinous hat crowns, or that all things here upon this earth that flock together are not necessarily sheep, Presbyterians, gangsters, or porpoises. So, as Martin Shaw, again, at Wim Van Outrecht, state in the book Redemption of the Damned, which is a reanalysis of kind of the cases that were featured in Fort's book, state, if an infinitely diverse reality can include the possibility of space vampires, and then might not it also be possible one of these more kind of mundane, prosaic kind of alternative explanations might be the solution? Now, none of these kind of explanations can fully align with the reports and all the details provided in Professor Acharius's report there. Some might fit at least a very few aspects of it, and if perhaps some of those eyewitness accounts were not as firmly established or consistent as Acharius implies, we might possibly come up with some of these explanations might be valid in this case. Now, unfortunately, as with most old cases, nothing really can be determined conclusively. In this case, all we have is that original report in the Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences. We don't really have any other documents from the time. We have his kind of secondhand story that, while he investigated personally, is still, we have his narrative version of the events. And so it's important to consider the possibility of specific local causes as well. Like I said, soap fire may seem kind of silly, but again, there was precedence for it. So we have to consider some of these local explanations, such as potentially volcanic ash in the sky. We know volcanic ash certainly does, just like fires, when there's big forest fires, all that ash in the sky can dim the sky, kind of red, reducing its brilliance. So you can actually look at it kind of during the day, much like these witnesses described. Now, we also must remember that this story is part of a larger pattern of similar accounts reported across the globe for centuries. What was a singular unknown event for Acharius and perhaps at his time, by the time Fort started kind of catalog and collect these events, many similar such accounts throughout history kind of had been recorded. And I shared this publication kind of last time, this Invasion of the Solar Bubbles catalog, also by Martin Schau, but by Chris Albach as well. And it's kind of a catalog of all these kind of solar bubble or luminous kind of like bubble cases that they've kind of like collected. So there's a history of these events, and the case I talked about last time could be considered one of these events, even though it didn't seem to leave any gelatinous kind of substance on the ground. Now, couple of the cases that kind of were mentioned in Shaw's book and elsewhere, kind of in relation to this case, were this case here. This first one, the supposedly true story behind the Blob. The Blob, of course, being the 1958 kind of horror movie. And this case happened on September 26th in 1950 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And at 10 p.m., policemen John Collins and Joseph Keenan are patrolling Vera Avenue near 26th Street in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when they see something like a parachute drifting ahead of them at treetop level. It's about 6 feet in diameter and settles in an open field. After summoning Sergeant Joseph Cook and patrolman James Casper, they go into the field to investigate. When they turn their flashlights on, it gives off a purplish glow, almost a mist that looks as though it contained crystals. Collins touches it and it dissolves in his hand, leaving an odorless, sticky residue. It completely evaporates within 25 minutes. Now, as mentioned, this event inspired producer Jack H. Harris to ask his friend Irvin H. Milgate to come up with a story for what would eventually become the 1958 horror film The Blob. This movie, The Blob, actually starred a young Steve McQueen in what is either his first or one of his first kind of major roles in a feature film. And this movie would be remade again, I believe, in 1988 and again in 1995 with Tracy Lords, I think. So it's been remade a couple of times, but it's actually based on a real case that these Pennsylvania policemen saw in 1950. Another case is a case that happened this week in history, and it's a case of strange web spinning flying cigar visits Ohio. And this is a case involving a school, kind of a mass kind of sighting at a school that shares some similarities to a case that happened on today's date, actually, in 1955 in North Carolina, another kind of mass sighting school angel hair event. But this event happened on October 22nd, 1954, in Jerome and Marysville, Ohio. And it happened at 3 p.m. Principal Rodney Warrick and teacher Mrs. George Ditmar at Jerome, Ohio Special School watch a large silver-colored object hanging motionless in the sky. Soon it takes off, and in its wake leaves a trail of whitish web-like substance that floats down and begins to hang from the wires along the road. And you can see that it supposedly had 6 square windows. The cigar had 6 square windows as it moved. It descends, and both strands and balls for 45 minutes kind of fall on the ground. Both adults get greenish stains on their hands from it. All of it dissipates, but the substance placed in jars dissipates more slowly. Now, of course, in this case, like many angel cases, Blue Book kind of defined it as spider gossamer webs that had fallen on the town. And this sighting actually, it was more than just Jerome, Maryville, and Ohio. If I remember correctly, the webs kind of fell over kind of that whole kind of region, like Illinois, Ohio, and other areas. So they were not the only ones to get this kind of a spider or angel hair or whatever you want to call it, the substance that kind of fell to the ground. So, and this is just a chart. I was just kind of curious with these angel hair cases, how many of them kind of seem to come from these globes or sphere shapes. And according to this chart that was produced by angel hair researcher Brian Boldman, he says roughly 29% of cases in the 72 cases he looked at in this study, the angel hair seems to fall from some sort of globe or sphere like object. This last case where it was kind of a cigar shape, I guess, seems to be a little bit more rare, only in about 14% of cases. Most angel hair cases seem to come from disc or saucers. Now, and in fact, today happens to be kind of like I say when three of the biggest kind of angel hair, most famous angel hair cases occurred. Today on October 27th in 1952, we have the famous Gaelic France case and the mass sighting in Florence, Italy, where supposedly 10,000 people at a football stadium game witnessed these two discs flying by, and it kind of dropped angel hair kind of on the crowd and area. And these are probably two of the more famous angel hair cases. And a couple years later, on today's date in 1955, we have again another case of supposedly hundreds of people at a school in Whitsett, North Carolina, that saw, kind of an object and left angel hair that they kind of collected. So these angel hair cases are interesting. There's a lot of precedents for cases like these. There's back kind of in the Fort Times and the Fortean days, they had what they called star jelly cases, where they would find kind of gelatinous substances on the ground that they would think would come from the stars. And not in every case is there actually kind of a sighting to go along with the substances found. But in some of these cases, there are. Is this the same phenomenon as was witnessed in 1808? Who knows? But it's interesting. It's Some of these cases, the substances come out to be spider webs, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they seem almost synthetic. So again, I don't think there's one answer for all these cases. So we shouldn't really try to necessarily bundle them all in the same bucket. We should approach each case individually. Okay, that's what I got for you guys today.